The ceremony, getting back to the ceremony in this kindergarten class, LifeSite News described it this way. After the teacher introduced the 5-year-old student to the class as a boy, he then went into the bathroom and emerged dressed as a girl. The teacher then reintroduced her to the children, explaining that she was now a girl who now had a girl's name and was to be called that from now on. According to Keller, who's this guy from the family group, he said kids were left really deeply emotionally bothered and traumatized. There were several of the little girls that went to their parents and were crying, saying, "Mommy or Daddy, am I going to turn into a boy?" This is evil. It's evil. Okay, teachers who are teaching entire classrooms of small children that they can magically transform into members of the opposite sex. Okay, it's so funny. These people will say that if you teach people about religion, that that's teaching them myth. That if you teach them about Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, that that's myth. Okay, this is significantly more mythical because it runs absolutely counter to biology. And the idea that kids are not malleable when it comes to sexual orientation, they're not malleable when it comes to gender identity, there's no science that demonstrates that at all. None. Okay, there may be genetic predispositions toward transgenderism. There may be. There may be genetic predispositions on sexual orientation, but to suggest that environment plays no part is to ignore every single piece of available data ever. Like all of it. Not some of it, all of it. And yet this is what they say because there's an agenda, right? The agenda is to make it clear to children that gender identity is fluid. This is one of the things the left wants to do, is tear down the basic building blocks of Western civilization in order to build something anew. If we're all widgets, if we're all just claymation figures in their little parable of life, then they get to morph us however we want. They get to mold us and morph us however they want. And that means taking over our children and using them against us and using them against our standards of right and wrong. So the left, which will say that they have the power to go in and tell your 5-year-old child that he may be a girl, right? This is the same left that says that if a teacher prays on the 50-yard line, that teacher ought to be fired. There's a case out in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals today. It's an amazing case. Okay, Bremerton School District is a school district in Washington State, and the assistant football coach at one of their high schools, a guy named Joseph Kennedy, prayed at the 50-yard line after football games and before them as well. Students frequently joined him. He would also give them religiously oriented motivational speeches. The school district tried to punish him for doing this. He settled for praying alone after games, but then he began praying at the 50-yard line before everyone had gone home. So instead of waiting till everyone left and then praying at the 50-yard line, he would go over right after the game. The game is over. He goes over, he prays at the 50-yard line, and surprise, surprise, a lot of the kids started joining him. And people started coming down out of the stands to join him, praying on the 50-yard line. End of the world. How dare he? Public school teacher praying by himself on the 50-yard line? People joining him voluntarily must be fired. So the school district fired him. They suspended him, and then they allowed his contract to expire. So Kennedy sued. He suggested religious discrimination under the First Amendment. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found the school district had every right to dismiss Kennedy. So there were two legal questions here. Okay, first legal question was he a public employee? Second was, as a public employee, did he violate his job description as a public employee by doing this? So there are two separate legal questions. The court said when Kennedy kneeled and prayed on the 50-yard line immediately after games, while in view of students and parents, he spoke as a public employee, not as a private citizen, and his speech therefore was constitutionally unprotected. The case they make in favor of this idea is, one, he's still wearing all of his high school gear. Second, if you were just a citizen, you couldn't walk out to the middle of the 50-yard line, right? You have to be a member of the high school staff in order to do this. So I think that this is actually legally arguable. Is he doing this as a private citizen, or is he doing this on school grounds, on school time, and therefore he's doing it as a public employee? It's a little bit more confusing than that, because the fact is that if you're at school, like if I were a public school teacher and I decided to daven mincha, which is the second Jewish prayer of the day, and I went in a broom closet somewhere and prayed mincha, that doesn't mean that I would necessarily be acting as a public school employee. Clearly, I'm attempting to separate myself. The court found he was acting, however, in his auspices as a public school employee. But that isn't really the worst part. The worst part is that the court then said what he did violated his job description. Okay, praying at the 50-yard line, doing a voluntary prayer that people decide to join, violates his job description. Now, let me explain what his job description was. Okay, Kennedy's job included becoming, quote, a coach, mentor, and role model for the student athletes. It included an explicit job requirement to attempt to create both good athletes and good human beings. It is directly in his job description. Kennedy's post-game prayers originally lasted a grand total of 30 seconds. They were a brief, quiet prayer of thanksgiving for player safety, sportsmanship, and spirited competition. Over time, they morphed into motivational speeches given to students of both teams. Even people on the other team would come over because they enjoyed what he was saying about sportsmanship in the games. Students voluntarily wanted to hear him. The district suggested these activities violated school board policy that said that, quote, staff shall neither encourage nor discourage a student from engaging in non-disruptive oral or silent prayer or any other form of devotional activity. Okay, this didn't violate that. The guy literally went out to the 50-yard line, knelt down, and prayed. That's it. He didn't say people have to show up. He didn't force anybody. He didn't tell people that if they showed up, then if they didn't show up, then they would be kicked off the team or suspended. The school board openly acknowledged that Kennedy didn't force anyone to pray with him. But the school board insisted that Kennedy not allow students to pray with him at all, that he should forcibly turn them away. That if he goes to the 50-yard line and kneels down and he starts to pray and a bunch of students crowd around him, that this is some sort of evil, that he's violated his public school duties, and he should tell them forcibly, get out of here, you're not allowed to be here. They said that any activity had to be, quote, physically separate from any student activity, and students may not be allowed to join such an activity. So what actually started all of this? What actually started all of this is, of course, he did this 50-yard prayer thing, and the Satanists, being good Satanists, devotees of Satan, suggested they wanted their own right to pray on the field. Because obviously there's no difference between Satanists praying on the field and people of Judeo-Christian values praying on the field. Not all religions are created equal in quality. Okay, if you're going to bring up a child in the Church of Satan, I don't think that child ends up exactly the same as if you bring the average child, as if you bring up a child in the Judeo-Christian value system. If it were, then Satanism would have created the greatest civilization in the history of mankind. It didn't. Okay, so the district responded by telling Kennedy he had to pray only when the stadium was empty. He disobeyed, and he started praying right after the games because he said, listen, it doesn't make any sense for me to pray an hour after the game on the 50-yard line. The game just ended. I want to thank God for a good game and for everyone staying safe. Now's a good time to do it. So the court found in favor of the district. So as I say, first they found that he was a public employee. They said the speech at issue is directly, at least in part, to the students and the surrounding spectators. It is not solely speech directed to God. So this is really dicey territory the court is getting into right now. They're saying that his prayer was directed as a public school employee at others. Okay, I wear a yarmulke. I wear it around. It's a public sign of my faith. Millions and millions and millions of Americans, including many people on the left, wear crosses around their neck. That is a public proclamation of faith. Is that them privately saying, I believe in Jesus if you wear the cross, or I believe in the Jewish God if you wear a yarmulke? Or is that me preaching to you? Do you feel preached to every time I wear my yarmulke? Because if you do, I would suggest that maybe you need to get a life. If you feel preached to because you don't like what I wear on my head, then this is because you're a loser. Okay, and if you feel preached to because a high school coach by himself goes to the 50-yard line and prays, then you are a doofus and a loser, and you need to get a life. But obviously that's not the priority here. The court said, by kneeling and praying on the 50-yard line immediately after games, Kennedy was fulfilling his professional responsibility to communicate demonstratively to students and spectators. Yet he took advantage of his position to press his particular views upon the impressionable and captive minds before him. So they're saying, okay, so his viewpoint means something because he was acting as an employee. That brings us to the second question. And the second question is, did that violate his job, which is to create better human beings and better students?
Well, for all of our lives, we've lived in a world of boys and girls, but that is changing along with everything else in 2017. In Canada, the country directly to our north, the parent of a baby successfully petitioned to have that child given an ID card with no sex listed, insisting that that is for the baby to decide. Things may not stop there. They probably won't. The Gender-Free ID Coalition is calling on the Canadian government to eliminate sex and gender classifications for all children throughout that country. Are we ready for a world here where baby boys and girls are replaced by baby somethings? Nell Given-Daly is a psychotherapist, and she joins us tonight. Nell, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you so much, Tucker, for having me. It's a pleasure.
So these are questions that didn't exist like 18 months ago. Homo sapiens have been around 300,000 years, and for the most part, it was kind of obvious who the boys and girls were. But we've decided in a very short period of time that none of that is real, and we're changing it, because why?
Well, to be honest with you, we believe that people who are considered intersex, people who are born with both sets of genitalia, have existed throughout human history.
For sure.
So the federal government just released a study in 2016 that 1.4 million people now identify themselves as transgendered, and Canada isn't the only place that's doing this. Legislation was just introduced in Washington, D.C. and in New York over the past couple of months to also have parents have the right to, on a child's birth certificate, not just say that the child is male or female, but also X or unidentified.
But I think you may be conflating two things.
Sure.
So the number of intersex births in this country, that is where a child has both sets, partially or fully formed, of genitalia, is maybe a little over 700 per year out of about 4 million births. So it's less than 1/10 of 1%. So very small numbers, tiny number. Okay.
Sorry, Tucker.
And probably we can assume that's been consistent through time. But and nobody is suggesting that, you force a sex onto a child whose sex is not clear. But for most kids, overwhelming number of kids, it is clear. So why should we pretend it's not clear? I guess that's the question.
I think it's a great question. I mean, as to your statistic, I had trouble finding accurate numbers as to how many children are born in this country who are intersex.
Right.
I got numbers that say 1 out of every 1,500 births, also 1 out of every 100 births, where there is some sort of either anomaly.
Hold on. 1 out of every 100 births has there is separate sets of genitalia.
Well,
I don't
not
think that's
necessarily.
right.
It doesn't have to go that far. So there could be some sort of like genetic, I don't want to say abnormality, but an anomaly, right? Like a chromosomal anomaly that it's not so clear, meaning that gender is not necessarily based on genitalia. And so I think your other question, though, is should we give people the right to say we're going to raise a child as non-binary, meaning we're not going to raise a child as male or female, which is something that the couple in Canada is
right, because
doing.
I mean there are legitimate, I think, medical situations, and you've just described some of them where it's an open question, and I would never deny that, and of course you want to respond compassionately. But that's not what this case is about. This case is about the idea that you get to choose what your sex is, which is a denial of biology. And there's also, and I think as a psychotherapist you'd agree, a cost to a child. If you say to a little kid, I don't know if you're male or female, you decide, I don't think you're going to get a good outcome a lot of the time at all. That's why people have never done that through human history. You know,
the couple that is, or the person who's deciding to do this with their child up in Canada, the point, I spoke to them on the phone, the point that they are making is that this child is a spiritual being having a human experience, not a human being having a spiritual experience. So it's actually a very spiritual endeavor. And what it's saying is that let's just let the child be a child, and eventually the child will decide what it wants to be, how much it wants to identify as a boy or how much it wants to identify as a girl. And this person is also saying that it's not that I'm not going to raise a child as a girl or a boy. I'm just going to say to the child, you just be a child, just be an individual for a while. Let's not have the government interfere with who you are. Let's not put a set of preconceived notions about who you are onto you. Let's just let you develop as a human being, and eventually you can decide whether or not you want to be a boy or girl or non-binary.
Yeah, but you can't actually decide. And I'm for choice, and there are a lot of biological realities that I'm sad about, that I would change about I'm sincere, that I would change about myself. And so I'm not attacking anybody, but don't you think that biological reality matters, and lying to kids and telling them, actually you could be 6'7", or you could have blue eyes instead of brown, or whatever. I mean, those are lies, and it's never a good idea to lie to kids, is it?
I don't think it's a lie. I think it's actually giving children more information at a younger age than we traditionally have. Right? So it's like, I'm going to give a comparison. It's like raising a child to not assume that they're heterosexual. Right? The way I've raised my children is to say, like, I don't know what they're going to be, and I'm not just going to assume that they're gay or they're straight. I just give them lots of information, expose them to lots of people.
There's a difference here, because whereas, we don't know a lot about the biology of homosexuality, we know a lot about the biology of sex, because we know that it begins on the chromosomal level. Like, there's a science piece to this that's being ignored by people who I thought believed in science. So that's why I'm a little bit confused.
I don't think it's being ignored. I think what we're seeing, though, in the federal study and what's come out in terms of the Census Bureau is that if 1.4 million people don't identify with the gender marker that they were given at birth, we have to take note of that and say what's going on, that there's a fluidity about gender, and it's not necessarily rooted in biology.
Why does that not extend to race?
Tell me what you mean by that. You're going to have to explain that one to me.
If I can say I'm a woman, why can't I say I'm a Chinese woman and be taken every bit as seriously? And I'm not mocking you. I'm making a sincere point, and it's a sincere question. What's the difference?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think as we progress as a society, some of these labels that we're putting on things, and I can't necessarily go to the race question, although one of the things that I've loved about your program as of late is that you're really into this idea of having a more